welcome back to Turnbar Time. Big milestone for this episode. It is episode 20. I am the Turn.
I'm the Bark.
And we're going to be here a long time. Welcome. Big milestone for us, Barker. That's awesome. I'm just super pumped about this whole moment. Yep. Shaka brah. So we are going to talk about, as you can tell behind myself and behind Barker, we have a content-driven episode. We are going to compare the worlds of North and South. And again, we're talking United States history. So the North being there, perfect. Couldn't have picked a better map. And the South, the North being in blue, South being in the gray. And this is a more updated map with including all the territory that we gained during Manifest Destiny.
Also important, these are all the states that were there for the election of 1860, which is where Abraham Lincoln will win. Hashtag no spoilers. Don't go see Our American Cousin. It kills. But anyway, terrible history joke.
It had killer reviews.
Killer reviews, yes. Knocked him in the back of the head. But like I was, as much as I know history, like Oregon's a state during this whole time period, but it's like, does it really do anything? California does a little bit, but yeah. Kansas should actually be blue as well. So that's a little bit off. So, but yep, we're here. We're going to look at 4 different categories that talk about how the North and South are different. We're going to look at geography, economy, transportation, and society. So with that, Turner, do you want to go ahead and kick us off with the geographia of the North?
So the North, as you can tell, again, we're looking at the blue states up there. So the North has basically the guarantee. So first off, we'll start with climate. They have all 4 seasons. And what I mean by that is they experience a summer, fall, and then a winter and a spring. Now, areas like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and even into like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, they're going to have harsher winters, shorter growing seasons. Again, they're more northern latitudes, allow for longer winters. Areas like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, and Iowa are going to be more along the lines of like they're a little bit lower in latitude, so their winters aren't going to be as harsh as like say New England or like northern Midwest winters.
Yeah, and so flipping that around and talking about the southern colonies, obviously everybody should know the closer you get to the equator, the middle of the Earth, the warmer the temperatures get, which is, again, explains why the northern colonies have a harsher winter and the southern colonies don't. Think about where do people want to go for vacation. They want to go to, Disneyland, Disney World, Six Flags, everything that's down near, or they want to go to Mexico because it's warmer, because it's more exposure to the sun. So they have milder winters in the south, longer summers, much more humid. Ugh. If you've ever been back east in the summer or the spring, humidity kills. We got lucky when we went on the DC trip with the kids.
Yeah.
That was the dream. When I went to Kuwait, I had a layover. I stopped to see my buddy, and it was like you walk outside and feel like you've been running, around the track for 1.5 miles in your street clothes, and you just walked outside. It's just so sticky. I have no other word to describe it than sticky.
So I have a good analogy. It was basically because I worked at a summer camp in Pennsylvania, so it was the same concept. And that was you took a shower on Monday and you weren't dry until Friday. Like you just basically walked out your door and just start sweating.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we'll see is that the Appalachian Mountains, which we've talked about earlier in our content throughout the year, run down kind of the eastern seaboard of the United States. And as they get further south, they kind of push more to the west. So in the Northeast, there's not a lot of land between the mountains and the coast. So there's not a lot of room to grow stuff. But as the Appalachians kind of jog to the west, it opens up more territory for farming in the south. And this is kind of a segue into, because this is a map of crop distribution in the South. And this is what we see is purple is tobacco. So you see up there in Virginia, right, where, they started with, Jamestown. My daughter's just got Pocahontas princess boxes, so we watched that the other day. So bad history by Disney.
Terrible.
The green is rice, which is right on the coast because it's grown. If you don't know how rice is grown, it's actually not planted in the ground, really. It's grown in like a swamp. So that's perfect in that tidewater area. And then you have the green or the yellowish kind of mustard color right down here, and like what would be Nolans is sugarcane, which again needs a tropic environment, much more prevalent in like places like Jamaica, Cuba, in the Caribbean, Trinidad, Tobago.
St. Croix. That's why Alexander Hamilton, one of the big things, like the island that he lived on, St. Croix, before he comes to the United States, is all sugarcane, and he realized it because the whole island functions around sugarcane. So.
Yeah, and then what you see is is it okay if we transition to economy?
Well, that's what I figured you were already doing. You're good.
Okay. So the new crop, the economy in the South is agrarian. So agrarian, if you think about it, has the right? Agriculture. So deals with farming, people who like farming policy from the government. This red that you see kind of like looks like it's flying out of the side of my head over to the eastern seaboard. That's cotton, the distribution of cotton growth, which really becomes the big crop in the South. And so if you don't know what cotton looks like, you should, because it's a lot of clothes are made out of it.
White gold.
Yep. And the problem with cotton initially was that, and Turner does a great job. We get bags of it from Utah State, I believe.
Utah State University.
Shout out. And we've tried to clean. I personally tried to pick cotton fibers off of a seed by hand, and like you will literally develop like fiber burns on your fingers, like from and I'm not moisturizing as much as I should, but you end up with these fiber burns on your fingers, and it was just one person can only do like to get clean cotton. It takes an extreme amount of time until a man by the name of Eli Whitney, who is just kind of a natural inventor, looked at it and said, "Hey, I think I can make a machine." He was from the North. He's actually from Massachusetts, then moved to Georgia, and then like within months, I think he makes the cotton gin.
Yep.
Which is actually the cotton engine. Because it's a machine. So you essentially dump in raw cotton with the seeds in it. You turn the wheel, and then these little spokes here in the middle, right, eventually pull the seeds out mechanically and then move the lint or the fibers that you want to take and make into product into the end without any of the sticky seeds in it. Right. And it increases production by, what is it? With a cotton gin, you could do the one person on a cotton gin could process as much cotton as 50 people by hand a day. I mean, so you think about the output that's happening, and like slavery, everybody thought slavery was going to die out, but with the cotton gin, it actually leads to a spike in slavery again, because the production of cotton, you still need people to go out and pick it from the field. People haven't developed tractors to do that yet. And so the cotton gin makes cotton way more profitable. And eventually the South will be exporting so much cotton that if you add everything else together that the United States exported versus cotton was there was more money being made in the United States exporting cotton than all of their exports from the US put together.
Sounds about right. It's also like, I think the American South basically becomes like the world supplier of cotton, and we don't lose that title of world supplier of cotton until I want to say it's like the 1900s, when Egypt finally takes it over, and Egypt is the number one cotton producer in the world now, I believe. So
well, and the reason that happened was the Civil War.
Yeah.
When the Civil War happens, there's a disruption, and the British Empire is going, where do we get cotton from now? And then they go, well, I think we could grow it in the Nile River Valley. And they move it down there. And that's why today, like when you go out and buy bed sheets, everybody's like, ooh, Egyptian cotton.
Yep.
Right? Thanks Civil War. Yep. But that kind of opened the door for the Egyptians.
Yeah. So taking over to the North economy. So like Barker explained, the Southern economy is focused on agriculture. Like that's their whole goal. It's Jefferson's ideal society, right? Agrarian. Everyone's growing crops. The North is different. So when the cotton gin was invented, right, that kind of is the North helping the South in a way, right? Eli Whitney's from Massachusetts, but it also leads to other machines. So the Industrial Revolution takes place in England in the late 1700s and then starts to spread to the United States and the rest of the world. England is very protective of all of their patents and everything like that. They keep all their machines under lock and key, like they're hidden. You know, foreigners aren't supposed to go into any of these factories. They're not allowed to, because England knows that if they can manufacture cotton, textiles being one of the biggest things, they will be one of the richest, you know, empires in the world. Well, there's a man by the name of Francis Cabot Lowell. He lives in Boston, and he goes over to England in about 1810, and he goes to a factory, but he disguises himself as an English entrepreneur, right? So like English people can share these things. And while he's there, he actually looks at the machines and he starts like copying them in his mind along with like a notebook, drawing them. And he smuggles these drawings and everything out of England and gets them to the United States, where he will open one of the first textile factories in the United States. And what he'll do is he will have both the spinning and weaving machines inside the same building. And at this time, right, we don't have electricity or the steam-powered engine or anything like that. So he basically has to set up near a river where a paddle wheel can pump his machine and drive his factory. And one of the things that will come off of this is the fact that he will start hiring women to work in the factories. And so this will be the first time that women will kind of step outside of the household and work in a factory assembly in the United States. And I'm not saying it's the very first time, but it's one of the most known and prominent changes. And then we have the invention of the steam engine. So again, the idea of like making a fire, heating water, steam drives the machine, and it starts powering factories, where factories now don't have to exist near water. They can exist anywhere as long as you have these machines and you're powering them. And then Eli Whitney comes back on the scene again, and he says, hey, instead of making a unique machine, right, like just one machine that you make for your factory, he's like, let's make machines in a machine factory where parts will be the same no matter what, right? Because one of the biggest things that people have is like, let's say Barger has his factory and he goes to fix the machine, he has to go make that part unique for his machine. Whereas if we have interchangeable parts, what we know today, right, I can go to a part factory, say, okay, I need this part, go get it, fix my machine, right? And that's a big deal. Like, we don't talk about interchangeable parts. Interchangeable parts will play a role, though, in mechanizing the world, basically, in the fact that, like, we've talked about the Civil War, that's what we're leading up to. Guns used to be unique. Like, every single gun was unique, and you had to try and make it fit. And all of a sudden, Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts, you're like, let's make guns with interchangeable parts. That way, if a gun breaks, we can take another part off a gun and fix it. So that's pretty unique. Also, this starts pushing out, how do I want to say this? Skilled labor, right? Because I can teach somebody to do one part of the process, whereas somebody who was making cloth by hand, this was a very labor-intensive way of doing things. And so those people lose out on their jobs, their skilled craftsmanship, because now factories can pump this out. However, what also happens is that, how do I want to say this? This mechanization continues to also help the northern agriculture. So again, like the geography of the north, like New England is not a good place to grow food. It's rocky soil, it's sandy, it's not a good place. So that'll develop into shipping and doing all those things where they will trade with the rest of the world, fishing, whaling, trading, those types of things. And then manufacturing now has been added. But the areas that are still in the north, but in the west, so we're talking again, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, those areas are going to benefit from mechanization in terms of growing their crops. And there's a famous name that comes up, and that gentleman's name is John Deere. Maybe you've heard of him. Maybe you've seen one of his tractors before. But he invents the steel tip plow. And so now this reduces the amount of labor it takes to plow a field, and easier to plant, which means you can grow more crops, which means that you can have more people eating that food, which means they can be doing other things instead of growing food for themselves. So the North's economy is based entirely, I would say, or sorry, I shouldn't say entirely. The North's economy is based majority around manufacturing and shipping different products to the rest of the world. And one of those things is the South and the North need each other, because guess where they're getting all the cotton to run their factories to make textiles or clothes or cloth? They're getting it from the South. It's a great partnership. Okay, but one of the most important partnerships, and the thing we need to stress, is this is a partnership that is based on the backs of slaves.
No. Okay. Do you want to move into transportation?
I'm talking a lot. You jump in for transportation for right now.
Okay. Well, mine's pretty short and sweet. So as Turner was saying, like the steam engine comes about. Oh, I need to sit back a little bit. I'm getting too much in the action. So when we're used to seeing like these Mississippi riverboat steamship casinos, back in the day, like they were actually used as cargo ships, and it's hard to see. Let me see if I can make this. But and I'll make my
all bales of cotton, right?
I'm gonna shrink myself. Hello, everybody. No, yeah, those are all bales of cotton on the side of that ship. So what they would do is steam power changed the game, because what they did initially with the Mississippi River, which is like the great highway of the South uses rivers. They don't develop railroads to nearly the extent, I think only about half as many miles of railroad as the North creates, because they're so dependent on rivers. And the rivers on the eastern seaboard are fairly broad and fairly deep, to the point where you can actually take some of the ocean-going ships and sail them inland and just dock them next to the plantation, load them, and then there's no middleman. Like you think today with Quincy, like we take our agricultural products, put it on the train, take it to the port of Quincy, it gets put on a barge, and the barge goes down the river potentially, and then eventually that barge gets offloaded, and then it gets loaded onto container ships to go to Japan or China or wherever. You cut out the middleman, you can just allow those big ships, like if you think about being able to load things like they do in Portland or Longview, my hometown, right? Yep. The ocean-going ships go all the way up the Columbia River right to those towns, get to the pier, and then they can be loaded right there. But the big thing that steam power does is that it's really easy to get boats down the Mississippi River, down to New Orleans, where the river meets the sea. But it's really difficult to get back up the Mississippi River trying to use manpower or wind power, because you're fighting the current the entire way up the river. And so steam changes the game, and it allows, to use steam to fight the current and get back up. Because what people would do is they would essentially make these rafts or barges, and they would sail them from their farm, potentially even from Ohio. Yep. Right? Products from Ohio are going to come down through New Orleans, because it's easier to bring stuff down the river than take it over the Appalachians. Yep. And so people would bring these rafts down. They would sell their products at New Orleans to get it put onto an ocean-going vessel, and then they would essentially just scrap the raft. Yep. And walk or buy a horse and ride home. Yep. And then do the whole thing again. Yeah, do the whole thing again. Yeah, but so steamship really revolutionizes that. It's not without its concerns, right? You have a boiler. Boilers can explode. There's actually I can't think of the name of the ship, but there was a really terrible steamboat accident on the Mississippi that is almost comparable to the loss of life of the Titanic. It gets far less press because it was far less impressive of a vessel. But you think about that, you're on a wooden boat that's being powered by essentially creating a fire that turns water into steam. Fire on a wooden vessel seems kind of kind of like filling an airship full of hydrogen.
Yeah, no kidding. Good Lord. So let's see. I have the boat right here. It's called the Sultana.
Yeah, that's it. That sounds right. No.
and it was overloaded. The casualty, the death toll indicates it was around 1,168 people lost their lives. So they were overloaded. They weren't meant to carry as many people or as much stuff as they were, and so the ship was having to work harder, and unfortunately exploded. 3 of the 4 boilers exploded. So are you wrapped up on that? So again, South is different, right? That's their number one.
Yeah, it's really the riverboat, and that's why it's so iconic. When you have people talk about kind of like the South, and people always want to use the riverboat, the steam riverboat is kind of you think about, our students are old enough to think of the USFL, but it was the Memphis, I think Showboats, that's not right. But Memphis, their AFL team, their mascot or their logo was, a riverboat for that reason.
Yeah. So North is different though. Again, with industrialization, you have to get your products from one place to another, and you need to do it quickly. So in 1806, Congress actually passes. So the first one I'm talking about is roads. Congress passes the National Road Act, and they build a road across the Appalachian Mountains into the north, or into what we call the Northwest back then. And it's hugely popular. Everyone loves it because up until this, roads were basically, as the book calls them, bone shakers. And I like that because if you've ever driven on a washboard road, right, and you just do this the whole time you're driving, or if you're the kid in the back seat, and I remember like you'd try and play Game Boy and it'd be like, right. But anyway, so it's so popular that Congress tries to do it again. They try to pass it saying like, hey, let's build roads in all the states. James Monroe, though, is president at the time and says he vetoes it and says it's unconstitutional to improve states with federal money, right? And again, we know now today that that's actually not unconstitutional because we do it all the time. So then what comes after that is, like Mr. Barker said, the steamboats starts powering it. And what we get here is we get canals being dug to move different people and products throughout the thing. So Robert Fulton is the inventor of the steamship, and he's the one who builds it, and he builds it in New York. And the goal is to get to the Great Lakes. And so in 1817, a man by the name of DeWitt Clinton, who's governor of New York, wants to build a canal from New York City all the way up to the Great Lakes. And so that way all the products like from Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota can now get to market a lot faster. It's actually sabotaged in the press. It's called like Clinton's Big Ditch. But it will be successful. It's a 363 mile long canal. And today, I want to say it's like 70% of the population of New York lives within like 10 miles of the canals still. So you had like booms in huge cities, but this also like got products, instead of having to go down the Mississippi River, now I can just get my products to the Great Lakes, put them on a boat, and they'll go, and I'm done. The last thing, and probably the most important thing, and I'm going to give a little tiny spoiler alert, is railroads. Railroads become a huge thing in the North, and they do not become a big thing in the South. The South has a bunch of different individual lines, whereas railroads by the 1840s are one of the North's major industries in terms of laying track. And they will have over 20,000 miles of track laid that will link the North together. And what that will do is it'll be huge. It'll be a major benefit come time for the Civil War, when you need to rush supplies and soldiers to the front lines, and you can do it by rail instead of having to walk, right? Or if you have to go upriver, right, you can't do that. You'd have to load everybody onto a steamship and stuff like that. So railroads are going to be a huge key. So the North, again, is more diversified when it comes to transportation methods. And the last thing we're going to talk about is society. So what's important to the people living in the North or the South?
Now we're going to transition to the Oak Alley Plantation. So this is actually a real plantation down in New Orleans. Very picturesque. I'm sure it's been in movies. I recognize this, like The Patriot. Makes me think The Patriot, right?
Oh yeah, I could be The Patriot.
Where the dragoons are coming down the. Anyway, yeah. Hashtag history nerd moment. But in the South, like we always think about the plantation owners and you think about these big columned houses, but really the people that lived on plantations were a minority. But they did hold a vast amount of the wealth. They had property, land, and they had slaves, and slaves were worth money. They were considered a resource. And they even like reinforced like the need for slavery as like a morally good thing. They were helping Africans become better people by keeping them in slavery and like teaching them Christianity. You know what I mean? And teaching them like how to be better, how to farm and be more productive than they would in their natural environment, which is ironic because the northern religious community is using the same book, the Bible, to say that slavery is completely morally reprehensible and like unjustifiable. So it's just kind of like it's in the eye of the beholder, you know, how you're going to see that. And it's almost a little bit of the white man's burden where they feel like, you know, as the dominant people of the planet, so they believe it's their job to help other people get better. But only 1 in 4 people, like 1 in 4 landowners in the South actually own slaves. Not very, like the people that grow up on plantations, they get to send their kids to college. They can afford it. They can afford private tutors. It's pretty spread out and sparsely populated. So public schools don't develop. And so a lot of kind of like lower level or like the majority of farm kids or farming families, like their kids don't go to school. They don't get a very good education. My family's from Arkansas, and I remember when I grew up watching John Wayne movies, and I was watching some Civil War John Wayne movie, and I said something about, oh, the bad guys, and my dad was like, well, you realize that if we lived back then, John, we would be the bad guys. And I was like, oh, no. But he's like, you know, talk about slavery, and my dad's like, oh, no, our family in Arkansas, we wouldn't have been able to, we didn't have any. We were just, that wasn't in the cards for us. We weren't plantation owners. And talking about, you know, even some farmers were tenant farmers at that point. They were renting the land and farming, which is essentially what will happen to the slaves once they get freed, you know, later down the line. # no spoilers. But you also have some free African Americans that are living in the South. They have to wear a badge. They pay extra taxes. They're by far a smaller number of them. And then you have, you know, African Americans that are being used as slaves. And I think at this point it goes up. There's like 3 million slaves in the southern states. And we've since passed a law saying that we can no longer import slaves from Africa. We can only, I guess, breed or get more slaves by, you know, making slaves from slaves, having them reproduce and using them as a resource, which is kind of a crazy thing when you think about it, which is where the turn of phrase, hey, man, you sold me down the river, you know, which is something that I grew up people saying, but that's an adage that comes from slavery where, like, if a slave made their owner mad, they could literally sell their family of a slave, you know, like if they were married, which wasn't legally recognized because they were slaves, but a lot of them were allowed to like have families and set up, you know, de facto family units. If you angered your owner, he could sell your wife, your wife and your kid to, you know, different plantations up and down the river. Again, the river being the main mode of transportation. If you watch, you know, what is it? 7 Years a Slave.
12 Years a Slave.
12 Years a Slave, sorry. There's a scene in there with a mother whose son is being like sold, and it's just heartbreaking. Like my wife and I watched that movie and just like both felt dirty like after watching it. And it's like from where we are today, we look at that and go, God, like, how could we figure out that wasn't bad? But at the time, people thought that was like the model to live by. You know, this is a lithograph of a plantation on the Mississippi. And it was just, you know, you think about like Gone with the Wind, right? Is this hugely recognized film in the United States. And like, there's just some really like deplorable things that happen in the film that people at the time were just like, that's completely acceptable.
Yeah.
So, and by no means have we completely rectified all of the issues and problems that grow out of this, but that's that's a story for another day.
Yeah. The other thing that I want to point out is there are actually some instances that are pretty dark, but I believe, I gotta find this really quick. There are instances of actually free Africans owning other Africans in the South. It doesn't happen very often, but I mean, that's the kind of like mentality that's built into it. And like Barker was saying, where you have 1 in 4 people owning slaves, that's the status quo though. And so the people who don't own slaves aren't like eager to liberate the slaves, right? Like they have a good thing going. This is the way society is structured. We're not going to break the status quo. And that's a big thing that I always caught with the South was I was like, why, if only one guy out of every 4 owns slaves, why are the 3/4 really that like mad or butthurt when slavery gets like put on the docket to like be discussed? And it's because it's the status quo and you're coming in and trying to change something. So Northern culture, or society, has different viewpoints. So the big thing is Northerners actually still, for the most part, even though I've talked a lot about industrialization and things like that, live on farms of some kind. But the populations in cities are actually increasing to the point where the number of cities that go from having at least 2,500 people from 1800 to 1850. So let me restate that. From 1800 to 1850, the cities that go from having at least 2,500 people increase from 33 to 236. Okay, so a growth of 203 cities in a 50-year period. Except for like cities of like Detroit and Chicago, the 50 large urban areas are in the Northeast, and only 12 of them are actually in the South. The northern cities aren't exactly the cleanest place to live. They're pretty dirty, pretty foul. There's no sewer systems or anything like that put in yet. There's no paved streets. So it's not exactly the best place to live. But there is starting to get some class structure. So you find that as industries grow, you start to find like middle class starts to be developed, right? So you have your poor, you have your rich, and then you start to have this middle class where only one person has to work and the wife can stay home. And then the next thing is like we spent a lot of time talking about slavery. So Africans, after the American Revolution, a lot of the states in the North are very, very quick to pass anti-slavery laws. They're like, yeah, we're done with this. We're not selling. We're not trading. Right. And I know that like Aiden Buse, when he watches this, his big thing was like he was Rhode Island when we did our colony project. And Rhode Island was like the capital of the slave trade. It was like the #1 place where slaves were traded. And they outlaw it. So everyone starts banning slavery. But Africans are not equal. Okay. They still can't work for certain places. They can't go certain places. So there is segregation. And so, but what this does is it develops a little bit of African-American identity where they start having their own shops, their own places to eat, their own neighborhoods, things like that. The next thing that happens in the North, though, is actually they're going to be more prejudiced against immigrants. And when we talk about immigration, we talk about like push-pull factors. So either something pushes you out of your country or you get pulled to this country some way. So the Irish are going to be the #1, and I'm Irish. I think according to my DNA test that I took, I think I'm 52% Irish. And the potato famines that were basically their staple crop in Ireland for food, basically the famine destroys the potato crop. They have no food. They have to leave Ireland. So they are pushed out of Ireland. They come to the United States. And again, immigrants who are coming here, they are going to work for whatever, right? In this time. So they're like, hey, we got to work for something. And they're going to start pushing out people who have been here for cheaper labor, right? People are going to hire the cheaper the labor if they can do the same job. The next group that we're going to kind of talk about is the Germans. So those are the two biggest groups that come to the United States. The Germans are pulled here. they're middle class, right? They're not running. They're fleeing some unorganized revolutions against the government. Germany won't become a country until 1845, so they're fleeing like kingdoms and things like that. But they come and they're actually able to go inland and settle on farms and things like that. They have money to buy things. So that's why when you see you'll see like areas of like the Midwest today have like a German influence along with a Nordic influence. So places like Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Iceland are going to come here too because they've logged their countries already, and there's tons of logging around the Great Lakes, so they're going to travel over and join in some of that. But again, immigrants have a negative connotation with it when they come to the United States. And again, this is ironic, and it's ironic to even this day, because unless you are Native American 100%, somewhere along the line, somebody left a country and showed up in this one. And it's a country of immigrants. So it's really interesting to see like that. So again, the North is going to be more diverse than the South. And a lot of that has to do with the structure of like the manufacturing, which was led to because they can't farm. So the lack of farming in New England and the Northeast leads to a manufacturing, which then leads to a more diverse population of people living there.
And one of the other reasons the Irish get kind of like, I guess, victimized more than the Germans is, one, they're poor, and then two, they're Catholic. The United States, again, is Protestant, right? England broke away, and the majority of people moving to the American colonies were Protestants. And there's kind of this distrust. Like, it's really odd for us today to understand this, but for hundreds of years, Protestants and Catholics killed each other over what was the right way to be Christian. And in Ireland, it happened, still technically kind of happens from time to time. And so that was one of the big things. And also, like, the Irish, they were looked down on by the English because, well, they spoke Gaelic, they spoke a different language, and they were, again, they had a negative image from the British. The British are still heavily influencing American perspective. And the British were kind of pushing them out by stealing their land and kind of some shady business there as well. But I mean, that's what's interesting. It's in the term for that dislike for immigrants is called nativism. And the irony of nativism during this time period is the people that are saying, go back to Ireland, those people immigrated like 10 years, 20 years before. Yeah. I mean, it's not, even today, like, nativism has been a word that's been thrown around since the 2016 election with the whole campaign to build a wall and tighten immigration. It's the same argument. We can't have immigrants because immigrants will take our jobs, right? It's an economic, like we talk about history repeats itself. This is one of those cycles, right? When there's struggles in the economy, we always want to blame the person with the least amount of voice, which is the immigrant who's new, who doesn't understand, like, who's, learning the system. You know what I mean? So it's just interesting that trend hasn't been broken. But then eventually people always talk about, well, immigrants need to assimilate. But in a way, like, when we adopt them as part of our American culture, that's why we have St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, it's a big deal in all these countries. And like we talk about, like, I don't know if you've ever seen I think, is it Chicago that dyes their river green? I think. Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, it dumps a bunch of stuff in their river to make it green. Like, and it's yeah. I mean, we can talk about immigrants forever. So.
But anyway, two great, like, if you want to talk about, they're not great history movies, but like Gangs of New York goes over that. That it's a great movie about nativism and like the struggle between, Irish immigrants and like Irish people who've been here for a little bit longer. And then the other one I think about is that when the Civil War starts, the Irish are still coming, and depending on what boat they get on, they arrive in the United States either in the North or in the South, and the first job they get offered is to be a soldier. And there's a great song called Paddy's Lamentation about Irish leaving Ireland and then coming to America. And essentially, like, there's a great scene from Gods and Generals where it's the Irish Brigade of the South firing on the Irish Brigade of the North, where these two groups of immigrants are fighting each other when they have more in common with each other than they do with the armies that either of them are fighting for. And it's really heartbreaking, and that's why they put it in the film, because it's the irony and the sorrow of that whole kind of, where these people are being put is just terrible.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's another story for another video.
So, Thursday, dropping our shenanigans. Bigfoot. It's gonna be sick if you can find it. So, hashtag again. So I'm good. So I mean, what we need to do is we're outlining North and South because we're gonna talk about what leads us to war. So like next week we're gonna talk about the compromise system and how North and South start to clash with these completely different ideals. And then will eventually lead to the American Civil War. So, you got anything else?
It's one of the great struggles, one of the great kind of never-ending problems of America is how do we mash together? America is so big and so vast. How do we listen and meet the needs of the agrarian members of our society while also serving the needs of the urban, centers that we have, the big cities? How do you make, in Washington State's a great example of that right now, East and West. East is very agrarian, the West is very urban. And so there's all this angst about, how do we serve both? And we didn't do it very well in the 1800s. We'll talk about it. And the big underlying issue, of course, since the Declaration of Independence, the elephant in the room has been slavery. Yep. That nobody wants to talk about. They're like, we'll deal with it later. 1860, we're going to deal with it.
Yep.
It will rise to the forefront. So
come to a head. There's no you put it off. It's the way I always describe slavery is it's you got to cut and you put like a Band-Aid on it, and then right like that cut gets infected, and your result is I'm just gonna put a Band-Aid on this, and I'm just gonna keep putting a Band-Aid, keep putting a Band-Aid, keep putting a Band-Aid, until eventually you have to treat what's going on. So it's inherently contradictory to have a land where everyone is free to own another human being. So, all right, until next time, I'm the Turn.
I'm the Bark.
And we're going to be here a long time. Have a good night, everybody.
Be safe.
And be well.